One big part when building an iOS app is that you need to describe your data in a certain way, in a Swift way, so you can actually work with it in code. And this requires to look at what information you will have and then transfer it into essential types that we can work with in Swift. You also, a lot of the times, need to store this information on disk. For the project we are going to do this for this reading app, I have a list of reading items. For each of them, I have a name, and the title and the URL. So when you tap here, you go to the detail view and load this URL. When the user adds a new one or edits an existing one, I need to store this somewhere on disk so that when I leave the app and I relaunch later, this information is still there. And for this, we need to extend our data description to also use Codable, which is a protocol that makes it quite easy to store things on disk. I'm going to store this information in this apps directory. This video is the first part of a tutorial series where we're building this app, and in this I will focus on setting up the project, describing the data, showing this here so we can add new reading items, and also saving and storing. And then further in the next parts we're working more on this web views and the PDF views. Start by creating a new project. This is a iOS project app, and I'm naming this here Web Reading List App. This interface is SwiftUI. The first step for this project is to actually define the data in Swift that we want to use for this app. So in my project, to better organize this, I create a new folder for model. And here I'm creating my first file that describes this data. This is a new empty file from template. In this case, because it's a model, we use Swift file. SwiftUI, it's an interface file, but we are working with models. This is a reading item. We are now importing here foundation because I just want to describe the data in Swift. Now I already gave this a name. This is just one of these reading items, one of these blocks. In this list, I'm going to show for each of these reading items one of these rows with the essential information. So it's a reading item. And in this case, I'm going to use a newer API, which is the observation. This helps me with the data flow. In order to do this, I work with classes, so this is the reading item. And I have to add here a observable annotation. Now, in here, for each of these reading items, I need to describe all the things I want to store. Looking back here at my UI, I wanted to store a title. For example, here when I press this plus button, I want to add a title. This is a string value. So let's start with let title is a string. I use here a let, but maybe in the future I want to actually let the user change this. And in this case, I should change from let to a var. Then I want to add for each of these reading items a URL. Now, URL is another type in Swift that we can directly use. I could here make this URL or optional if I'm not sure if I can actually generate one. Other things I want to store here is the creation date, when I add this. So maybe in the future I might want to sort this list by recently added. This creation date of this reading item is a date type, again something we have in Swift. So this is a let because the creation date only is set initially, it's not going to change over time. We should not change this. Creation date of date type. Then I want to store if the user finished reading this. For example, I can swipe left to mark this as finished. This information is a Boolean. It's a true or false case of, oh yeah, the user already read this article or he didn't. So it's just a yes or no case. And for this, we can use Boolean information. So this is var has finished reading bool. If you, for example, want to show a reading progress, you might want to use a different property where you have started a little bit, 50%, 75% or 100%. Then you might want to use either an integer or something like an enum with different cases where, as I said, 50%, 75%. But for my case, I'm making it more simple, just has read or not. This is the information I want to store. Now you saw there's always this error here, which is class has no initializer. Classes in Swift don't have a default initializer. If you would have used your struct, you get the initializer per default, so I can just add here initializer. The next thing I might want to actually consider is maybe some of them already have a default value. When you use this initializer here, this is going to be used when I am opening this sheet to create a new reading item. You see here I only enter two things, the title and the URL. What's with the other two elements here? For example, the creation date. The creation date is always the current date, so in the initializer, I know that the creation date should be now, so the current date. So here I can give in the initializer a current date, just the new value. So this is date.now, just the now. And then the has finished reading. When I create a new reading item, I'm guessing the user didn't finish, so the default value for this one should be false. So we're setting here some default values for this. Okay, the next thing when I consider here my data is I wanted to show this in a list in SwiftUI, and I want to be able to select this here. So what I have to do in SwiftUI, I have to work with for each list, for each and selection. These have a couple of requirements. First of all, I need to work with identifiable data. So this means I need to conform to Identifiable, which has a protocol requirement of having a property called ID. So I'm adding this here. This ID is a letter or it's a let. It has to be exactly ID, the name, and I am creating here UID. Now, and I need to again consider the initializer. So I'm adding here ID of type UUID, and again I know this is created. I'm just setting one initially by creating a new one, and then self.id is ID. A lot of these protocol requirements when you data model helps you later on working with the UI. Other ones that I have to now do because I'm working here with classes, if you were for struct, you wouldn't need to do this, is hashable. This helps me when I do the list selection because SwiftUI needs to compare which of these. It needs to know, oh yeah, she selected this one and not this one, so it needs to be able to compare them. And this also requires equatable, which is now going to complain because I did not fulfill this protocol requirements, which are usually some functions, which are in this case functions to know is it the same element or not. So first of all, the equal function where you need to describe how if two of these objects here of my items are the same. So are they the same or not? I need to return a boolean. In this case, I'm like, if they have the same identifier, then they should be the same. So I can say left-hand side's ID is equal to the right-hand side ID. And the other function is the hash function. So in this case, I am using show.combine by ID. The last protocol requirement that I wanted to use is Codable. This is very useful when you want to store things on file, which we're going to do in a minute. In order to conform to Codable, all of your types need to be codable. So I have here these foundation types of string, which is codable. This URL is codable. You can also see this if I show quick help and then scroll down, and here conforms to. And the two ones that are included in Codable is decodable and encodable. So how do I transform it so that it becomes the data that I can store on disk? And the other one is how do I take the data that is on disk and get back my Swift type? So these are going to be very useful in a minute. Now, this is it for defining my data model. I'm just going to add a little bit more convenience here because I need to show something in my UI. I don't have much data yet. So let's just add some preview helpers. And in this case, I just want to add here some examples. I'm adding this as static so that we can call this on the class example. So I'm here returning one reading item. The initializer now I can use the one that we generated from title and URL. So the title is, for example, Apple. And then here this URL I can generate from string. So using the apple.com website, the initializer URL from string is an optional because maybe it cannot generate a URL from this. Maybe I put here something weird. In this case, because I work here with example data, I'm doing this with I'm force unwrapping this, which means that if I didn't do this correctly, it is going to crash on me, which I'm completely fine. I want to know if things are working or not. Then, so this is just one example, and let's just create another one, another static var examples, which is returning an array. So I have multiple of these, and we have something in our SwiftUI previews to show. So this is an array, and I'm going to use the first example, and then I'm just going to add 2 more. This is the data I'm going to use for testing my app, to setting up things. Okay, now that I'm finished with my data model description, I can go to the content view to start building things. In this case, I'm going to use a navigation split view. You could, if you only work on iOS, on the iPhone, also use a navigation stack. So here, I want to have a navigation split view with the 2 columns, sidebar and detail. In the sidebar, I want to show a list of my data, which is the reading information, the reading items. So let's just use the reading lists, which is a array of reading items and reading item dot examples. This is the array. Now I can pass this here, item in. To start out, I'm just going to show here the title. This is this 3 examples that we had, which is quite nice now. Next, I want to add the detail, and with navigation split view, you need to use this list selection, which has to go to a binding. I need to create now a state private var selection. This is of my reading item data. Optional, because, and initially if I'm setting this to null, nothing is selected. Now I can use this here to my lists and bind this to the selection. In this case, I'm using here the type reading item. I said just a minute ago, in order to work with lists, or for each, my data reading item needs to be identifiable. And we need to declare here an identifier. In this case, I'm using the UUID. Now, when you do this, the list, when you tab here, will pass the identifier, this UUID, to the selection property, which here is reading item. As you see, there is a mismatch of types. To override this default selection behavior, I'm adding a tag and say, okay, use the item itself. You see also here hashable. This is why we had to make our items, our data model conform to hashable, to this protocol to work with list selection. So this is then use this item directly. So now when you tap here, it goes to the detail view and it shows this. It selects this in this list. Now I need to actually show this in the list, in this detail view. So here I need to check if, let selection. Let's start by adding a placeholder for the selections title. Else, if nothing selected, I can show a placeholder. Unavailable with title and system image. Select a reading item and I use a book. Now this is not shown here in iOS. It's shown only when you see both columns at the same time, for example on the iPad. Okay, let's try again. I tap here and you see the title of this view. So the basic flow navigation is working, and I want to now improve this a little bit and refactor this because we're going to build out the UI quite a bit. So first of all, let's create a detail view for the reading item. This is going to be later where we load the URL. And to keep things organized, I create another folder for views. So I set a new file from template for the SwiftUI view for reading detail view. This view needs the reading data because this has the URL that I want to show here. Then we're changing the preview. And in this case, I use the other helper for this one example. So this is going to, for now, just have this one placeholder. And what I wanted to show is the URL, absolute string. So we see the URL that we have to do later. You can also add here to do, add web view. Now I go back into my content view and set this up for the detail to pass the information from the selection. Next, I'm going to extract this list separately. So this is my reading list view. New file from template. Again, a SwiftUI view. We're working on the UI. Reading list view, where I move this whole list over. Now this view needs the data, which is this reading list. So I'm just going to pass this downwards. And the selection need to be used in this views, in the content view. So I'm going to just pass it as a binding because the list needs to change it here. So in my reading list, I need to declare a binding var selected item. Now we need to fix this in the preview. I have to have some of these example data, which is in the static property for examples. And then I need to have a binding. So in this preview, I add a add state, add previewable selection of type reading item so that I can use this here. And this is then, when I go back to content view, replacing the sidebar where I pass this and a binding to the selection. Next, in this reading list, I want to here modify this so we see a little bit more. And I create this here as a file private struct reading item raw. This is a view for each of these items of type reading item. So I want to show a couple of informations. For example, in the VStack, the title. So this is still the same here. Just going to use this actually, so we have something in the preview. Then I can use the creation date, formatted, and in this case I can say in time, changing the alignment to leading, and I'm changing the font so it is more distinguishable. So the font is of the timestamp is captioned to make it smaller, and then I use a secondary foreground style so it's grayed out. So there's some hierarchy and looks a bit more organized. Then I wanted to add a little icon that shows if this item is actually finished or not. And this I want to have in front of the title of this whole stack. So I add a h-stack with an icon. This is an image from system name. Depending on if this has finished, I show different ones. So either a book or a filled book. And I show the foreground style of green to change the icon style. Now all of them are not finished, so we can also modify our model again, just to have a little bit more in the preview. For example, the second item I can just say has finished true. Going back. Now I want to have this icon on the same level as the title, so I need to change the alignment to first text baseline. Okay, the next thing I want to work on is actually adding one of these reading items, so on this editor. I'm going to do this in a new file, SwiftUI view, reading data editor view. So in this case, I want to create a new reading item, and the two properties that we need to add, as I said, was the title and the URL, for which I need to have a text field, which needs to have a string value. So I start by declaring two state properties for the URL and the title. And then I need to have here two text fields in a VStack with an alignment of leading. So the text field for title and the binding into title property, and then a text field for the URL binding to this URL property. Now I want to change the styling. In this case on iOS, this doesn't have a border, so I change the text field style to rounded borders. I'm adding this to the VStack, so both of them get this, and probably should add some padding. Next, I should add a button, two buttons actually, one for finished and one for cancelled, which I do next to each other in an h-stack. So button, title and action for cancel, and one button, title and action for save. To make these a little bit more prominent or striking, I'm changing their button style to, first of all, the first one is bordered and the second one is bordered prominent. I want to push them to the edge, so we're adding a spacer in this H tag. And I'm going to add a title first. Text. Create new reading item. And I make the font again to title. Okay, this is so much for building out the UI, but I need to actually now handle my data. This view is going to be used in the reading list view. So I'm going to add a button in the toolbar. Toolbar, button, action and label. So the label is add new reading item and the icon is just plus. Now this preview is not in a navigation stack with this list. This toolbar needs to go to the list. Now this list is not in a navigation stack, that's why we don't see the toolbar items. So in this preview, I am embedding this in a navigation stack. And now you have this button. Next, I wanted to show this sheet with this little editor. If you have a sheet, you can use different initializers, and the one I wanted to use is just is presented and content. I need a state property to toggle if this sheet is open or not. State private var new reading editor is shown, which is a bool, and initially it's not, so it's false. Now I can use this to bind this to this sheet. And the view that I want to use here is the one that we just generated. This is the reading data editor. When I press on this button, I'm toggling the state property, so the sheet is opened. So I press plus, I go in the live preview, I press plus, and the sheet is opened. Now I need to work on the data handling. If I press here plus, I create a new item, and when I press save, I want to add this to my list. The data that I want to modify is here, this reading list. I need to add one more. So I need to here, instead of a var, have a binding and pass this. And then we do some data manipulation, and then we need to also save these information sometime on disk. Before I actually do this, I want to change the way this is now handled. I want to change here the way I describe this. I don't want to declare all of this data always in the views, or this logic always in the views. I want to organize this a little bit better, and for this I'm going to use a ViewModel, a separate class that's doing this, adding these items, creating this, saving this to this, and loading this to this. So I'm going to create a new folder where we do these ViewModels, this data handling. This is new folder, ViewModel, and I create a new empty file for reading data ViewModel. So I import here foundation. And because I started with this observation, I'm going to continue. Import observation class reading data model. And this is conforming to this observable, which makes the data flow a lot easier. Okay, now what does this class supposed to do? I want this one to handle all my reading data, which means that this one should have the information, which is this array of reading items here. So I'm going to use this and move it over here. And in this case, it's not a let anymore, because I said when we're adding one of these, this needs to be a variable, a changeable. So let needs to go and change to bar. Because I'm working here still with some dummy data for now, I'm keeping here my example data. But we definitely need to do this a little bit better in the future. In a minute, we're going to change this and actually save this properly. Okay, this is it. And I can go back to my content view. So now we need to change all the views where I use this data, because I'm not using this directly, I'm using this class. So I start by add state private var, and I need to create a new instance of this reading view model. Now the list is complaining because it wants to have this information, and we need to go and decide what information we are giving this view. This is the view where I said I want to add this, and which should be in this class, so we should also pass this view model there. This now as a binding, because I need to, which means that this view now, when you do a binding, you give a reference to it and say, or you make it possible to change it. So the data, when I change something here, goes to the other view and back. So this is a bindable because of this new observation. Var reading view model. The reading view model, so I don't use this directly here. Let's see where it complains. Reading data view model. So first of all, this list now needs to add the reading view models reading list. I deleted too much. I should have not deleted the state property for selection. So scrolling down to the preview, the initializer here doesn't work anymore. And I just use a new one here. Okay, I need to go back to content view and pass now this view model. Okay, great, my data is there. Now I can go back to the reading list. Then I am opening this sheet. This needs to create this new item, which is now in this view model. So this sheet needs to also have access to this view model. So I'm just copying this to here, to this editor. I create this in this previews. Go back to the list. I can now fix this and also pass this view model. Okay, now finally I can actually create this new item on the save command. And I'm actually going to do this in this view model as a function. What we are going to pass is URL and title. So I go to this view model and add here a function. Add new reading item, and I'm passing the title, which is a string, and the URL, which is a string. Now I said this is the URL string. I need to actually have a URL. If you create a URL from string, this might fail, so I'm using here a guard statement, else return. Now, probably in the future, I should show error to user if string is not valid URL. Otherwise, the user is going to be confused. But for now, let's just keep it simple. Then I can create a new reading item from the title that we passed here and this URL. And I can add this to my reading list, append this new element. Now I go back, and here when the user presses save, I am telling the view model to add this for the title that we have and the URL, new URL string. Now I said this will create now this new element, but I actually want to also close the sheet. In order to easily do this, I use the environment property, environment for dismiss var dismiss, so that when I create this, I can also call dismiss, which should close the sheet. If the user presses here on cancel, I directly just close the sheet. So going back to content view, I press add, I add a title, I paste in a valid URL. One annoying thing is here that I have this auto capitalization. So you can also modify this to say auto-capitalize never. So we don't have these problems with this URL. But you see, I was now able to add these items with the title and these URLs. And this now adds this item to this list because the data is in this view model that is used for the list itself. So I'm passing here my data correctly. Now the next thing that I should actually do, I'm here saying save, but I actually didn't save it. It's just temporary in my app. As long as my app is running, this information is there, but I cannot save this. So the next thing that I wanted to do is actually add the functionality to save this to disk. So here I create a function save. When you save this to disk, we need to do a couple of steps. So first, take Swift types and convert to data. So this is binary data type that we can store to disk. We are going to use decodable conformings for this. And secondly, we need to get an URL. Create URL for file where we want to save this. And then lastly, we need to actually write the data to file. Okay, let's start one by one. I said that this reading item here is codable. This is very important. All my properties are codable. And because of this, I can now easily use a data conversion from my type to a binary data, which is with a JSON encoder. So this codable protocol has two sub-protocols, encodable and decodable. So we're starting with encodable. And this class has a convenience for encode. And I can here take the whole array of my items and encode them as a data. So this gives me this binary data. It can throw. So I am using a do-catch block to handle this throwing function properly and to see if everything goes well. I am for now error printing here this error information, so we have an idea what's going on. Okay, this is the first step. We have something. And the next thing is I need to have an URL to the file. The location for this file is going to be in the documents directory. This is in the iOS app sandbox. I'm going to link another video where I explain more about these locations and these directories and the sandboxing. So I'm creating a function to generate me a file URL, returning a URL. So the directory is going to be url.documents directory. It's just an easy way of accessing this directory path. And then I can construct an URL by adding a path component. And here you can define the name of this file. So this is just a dummy name. This is just an arbitrary name of reading list. I am here storing a JSON file. I used here a special encoder way of formatting this file as a JSON file. That's why it's also of this type. And this is what I'm returning here. Okay, this is then the URL. Next, I need to write this to disk. Data has a convenience function which is write to file. And here I am passing write to this URL. This is again for function it can throw, so I'm adding a try to this. And lastly, I'm going to add a print statement so we can actually have a look at this file, absolute string. Now this save function I'm calling here every time I create a new reading item. Okay, so I'm now going to build and run and test this. Okay, I see my example data. I press on this plus button and I can enter here a URL with a title. Now when I press here save, we should add this new reading item to the list. And it shows up here. And we also saved it to the disk, so I can now copy this URL or this container path. You see I did put it in the documents directory. I go to folder, I paste this location in, and here you see then the container, the directory for all the data. Under documents, I have now created this one document of JSON type. This is a formatted string text file because I used an array. You see here this array outside. So this is an array of these 4 elements. And for example, here, each of these elements is in these curly braces. So you have all the properties like has finished reading false for the apple. So this is the first one with these URL. So you see them also in here. The creation date, this all have a certain format. Then I have my second element with these lazy vCRUD URL. Then I have next curly braces under here my third element with these UIViewRepresentable URL. And then the last one that I added here, this is the new one, which is this apple.com with the name of test or this title test. So you see we have here this whole list of all the elements that I stored to this directory here, documents directory. Now I called this save function to store it to disk, and the next thing we also need to do is actually retrieve it. So I need to add here a load function where we need to inverse. So again, I need to have this URL, and then I need to retrieve my data. Data has an initializer contents of this URL. This is then giving me the data, and it can throw. So I add again a try do catch block. So we might get information about each of the errors that occurs. So catch, print, error, loading data. Okay, now I have the data. So we are here, the step. And the next one is I need to decode, so do the inverse, where we use a JSON decoder. So this is JSON decoder, which helps me to convert back from my binary data, the one that I have on disk, to decode to a certain type. In this case, I am here, the type that I had is this array of reading items. These reading items are codable, which means they're also decodable. So this is this array type self from my data. Again, this can throw. So this is reading items. And now I retrieve this, and I need to update this here to my data. So this is self.reading items is now these reading items. This reading list is now these new items here. We probably also can just make this shorter in one line. Okay, now that I have this function, for the first time when you install the app and the app launches, you won't have a file. So in this case, we have an error. A lot of the times you want to show default data to the user. So in this case, I'm just going to say the reading data list is the reading data examples array. The reading item is readings examples. If in the future you don't understand what you're doing, it's sometimes a good idea to create a function. This is use sample data. So in this case, I am doing this function here, and then I can, if I have an error, I'm using the sample data. Okay, next, when do I call this launch? I could do this in the initializer of this model here and call load here. In this case, I don't need to set here these values. I'm just going to set here the default one. In this case, I'm not setting anything here. Okay, so in the initializer now we will load. So I stop my app and I relaunch. Since we know now we have this file, it will call this load and load the previous ones. And if you see this, you see I have now my existing element. You can try this again. So I'm just adding here new item, save. This is saving to disk. Then I am stopping and I relaunch. You see this item is also there. Now my current implementation has this load and save function on two positions. We need to consider a little bit more widely. For example, what happens if I change here this item's reading status to finished? In the views reading list, here in this list, if you add a swipe gesture to the leading edge, you can then set the, in this case, I want to toggle the property for this finished, so I add a button, title toggle is finished. This should be a little bit more user friendly. And in this case, I would want to change the has finished reading property so that additionally, we might also do some stuff like editable, edit actions to say here all, which means this has two possibilities. One for move and the other one for delete, which means that I need to here use a binding for this item. Okay, so this argument is edit action selection. Now, in order to see these edit actions, you need to also add an edit button to the toolbar. Okay, so I said I can toggle this now. You see this icon is updating. I can do this edit. For example, I can remove one of these. I can also reorder them. Now, any of these changes are currently not saved until I create one new item. So this is clearly not good, because then I might lose a lot of information. So instead, we need to consider when should we actually call this save in addition, to make sure that when I close my app, I really save this. And you can use the environment property for scene face var scene face. And here I add on change, because I want to know when the scene face changes, so when the app goes into the foreground or in the background or is closed. So I can use a switch face. So we have the active state. This is when my app is launching. For example, we could also call the load function when this is called. So instead of the initializer, then I have background and I have the inactive state. So in both of them, we could call reading list model.save. Okay, this is not exhausted, and in this case, I just break. And on change, this modifier also changed a little bit, so you can get the old and the new value. I don't care about the old value. Okay, so when you launch the application, so in order to use this now fully in my reading data model, I'm not going to call load here in the initializer, because this is now handled when the scene phase goes to active, so when I launch my application. So if you now launch the app, you see I still have my data, because now it's called from within this view. This is convenient because then it's tied to the app lifecycle much better. Then I can delete this last, and then I make this one a finished one, and now I close the app. So I'm not going to here stop build, I'm just going to close the app normally. This is then calling these background and inactive. And you see here I'm saving and print the file location for this action. Now when I relaunch the app, when I stop and build again, you see it updated all of the new information too. You have this multiple possibilities to save and load now. For the initial I'm showing, using here the scene phase of active is quite a good possibility. For saving, you can do this when the app goes into background. If I close this here, you can add additional in between, because if the app crashes, this is not called. For example, if important things happen, when I add here new reading item, this is so important that I can also call save in this moment. You shouldn't call save too often. For example, if you have the possibility to change one of these items names and the user types, you don't want to change this every time one letter changes. You only want to do it when they finish. You could, for example, also do this if the user leaves one of the screens. Then you use the on disappear to again save this. If you have an editor open when the editor is closing, you can call it. So there's a lot of situations in your flow where you can save the data again. Okay, to wrap up this whole saving thing, we had to do multiple things. First of all, when you describe your data, we're working here with Swift types. So you need to have encapsulated data and describe it in Swift by using fundamental types that Swift has, like a string, a URL. You can also do something more advanced, which I didn't do with enums, or some subtypes that you embed in here. If you do this working with fundamental types, and most of them are codable, then you can take advantage of the Codable protocol. Helps you to store this data. I did all this storing and loading and manipulation in a separate view model, which means that I'm separating this logic, and here using MVVM, so model view model. In this view model, in this class, I have all the data that is there, so I can manipulate it here, and I also have access to store it and to load it. In order to save this, because I have codable data, I can use JSON encoder. I am accessing the file URL, the documents directory, and I'm writing this data. The opposite is, again, I use the same file URL. I access the binary data, the store data on disk. I'm loading this. I am doing the inverse for data conversions from the data, binary data, to my type with a JSON decoder. And I'm here have to specify what's the type that we retrieve, which is in this case an array of my type of my data. So that I can then update this in this view model, which is then used in my views and shown. These two functions, save and load, I need to now decide in my UI or during the app lifecycle. When do I call this? One of the best strategies is if you use the scene phase, which gives you information of, oh, your app just launched. Maybe you want to do something like load your data. Your app just went into the background. Maybe you want to save your data just to be sure. Or you're going into an inactive or closing state. Additionally, you can save this information also on important time steps in your apps. For example, when I create here a new item, which is happening in the editor, when I press here save, then also this ViewModel, in addition to creating this new item and adding it to the UI, it's also going to call the save to disk. Now, this was a long tutorial where I talked about data handle, describing this, saving to disk. In the next part of this series, I'm talking about how to integrate, how to actually show these URLs, how to load them with a web view. And then afterwards, I'm also talking about how to create PDFs from this and how to store PDFs in the documents directory so that they also see it in the files app here. So how do I add files to my local storage? In this case, we're going to work with PDFs and the directories and reading files and checking this what's stored in there. So this is then different to what I did here. Right now here I have the user-defined data that the user doesn't actually see. This JSON file is just for me as the app developer on the back end of the app to do all this storage. Whereas if I put some PDFs into the files app, this is something that the user will also see it. So the handling is a little bit different. And it's a good contrast in these two use cases that you might want to do. If you liked this video, give it a like and comment. I hope you're going to join me in the next part of the series, which you can find up here.